That's great. Normally, well, certainly in my former role, if I saw a room like this, I'd panic because I knew everybody was going to shout at me about something that was going wrong. So thank you for a lovely reception.
So we're going to, can everyone hear us at the back if we're having a conversation? If you stop being able to hear us and we start mumbling, give us a wee shout, because we haven't got mics or anything. So, just wave and we'll remember. Nick, let's start with your young life. Talk to us about your childhood, where you're from, what your parents were like, that kind of stuff, and how being gay sort of impacted you.
Okay.
Nice short question
for
to
the
start
next 2 hours. No, I was brought up in rural west end of County Durham, so a place called Weardale, if you know it. Specifically, a place called Wearhead, which is exactly the opposite end of the Wear to Sunderland. It's literally where the River Wear starts. And when I was growing up, my mum ran a cafe, and so we lived above the cafe. And my dad was initially a postman in the Dale, and then he got interested in mining and industrial archaeology. And for those of you that have heard of Killip, Lead Mining Museum, my dad was the person who basically drove the development of Killip, which meant that we grew up in the house had all sorts of bits of old mining machinery all over the place, and all the pictures of me and my sisters as kids were stood next to something for scale. And you can imagine growing up in a very small village in a very isolated part of County Durham in the 1900s. Not that friendly a place if you want to explore your full personality.
Yeah.
And so I was bullied badly and horribly at school, and I hated it. It was an awful experience. And I guess, many of us will have that kind of experience as well. It left a lot of scars for me that, they're still there. I try not to pick at them, but I've learned not to go back over them, but to understand that was a thing of a time. Because
were you being bullied just for being gay, do you think?
Oh, I'm being fat and wearing glasses and playing the violin and etc. Multiple tick lists here. And so, I mean, for me there were two issues. There was school itself, which was like a daily survival task, and there was the bus ride to school as well, which was an hour each way on a bus. That was also about survival, yeah, and of course this was in the age of Section 28. So bullying kids like me at school wasn't just ignored, it was actively encouraged by some of the teachers. It was a pretty awful, hostile environment. And one of the reasons I'm sort of going over this in a bit of detail is because I grew up as an outsider. I felt very much an outsider. And that's one of the things that later in my political life, I was absolutely determined that this would be a city where we didn't have outsiders. Yeah. And it was one of the two big driving forces, personally, for me, in terms of being involved with politics. And it was Section 28 that was the reason why I joined the Labour Party when I was 17.
Does everybody know what Section 28 is in the room? Does anybody need could you
they
give us
a
quick
history.
There's a lady at the back that needs a quick history lesson, please.
So Section 28 was the then Conservative government's banning of teachers or people who worked in schools or in education from talking about same-sex relationships as if they were promoted as equal to other relationships. And it was widely interpreted as gays are bad, we don't talk about them in school, and if anything happens to them, it's their fault.
Yeah, and it made you feel like gays were 1 in a million, really. And therefore we were really isolated, I think.
Yeah, and so that kind of sense of isolation was compounded by a school environment which was basically, trying to avoid the daily beating up.
God. So tell us then, how did you manage to do well out of this? Did you get good results at school? Did you?
I did. I got 9 GCSE grade A's and 1 grade B. Everybody wants to know what the B was for.
What was it
chemistry. And I then did A levels, and I wanted to go on to university, but my head of sixth form said that kids from my kind of background didn't go to university. So I went to work in McDonald's in Bishop Auckland, and I did that for a year. And while I was there serving burgers to the good folk of Bishop Auckland, I thought, I think I can do more than this. I think I do want to go to university. So I basically applied and went through the process, having had that year, and got into university.
Amazing. Were you out of the closet by now, or were you?
In some parts, certainly to family by then, yes, or some parts of the family. Not generally in the workplace, and not really I didn't really have a big circle of friends at the time.
So you've got to university. What was your degree?
Social and political theory.
Amazing.
Social and political theory.
Amazing. So tell us how you moved then on from university through to becoming council leader, because this is your career journey.
So when I was at university, firstly I got involved in student politics, which was enormous fun and was far more interesting than anything I had to do study-wise. And I was part of the LGBT society, and then I was also part of the Labour Club, and one of the officers of the Labour Club said, "Have you thought about running for student union president?" And I said, "No, why?" He said, "Because I think you'd be good at it." So I did, and I won. And that was a baptism of fire, I have to say, that year. Because most people do student union president the year after they graduate, so it's the sort of final thing they do. Whereas I did it after my second year, so I did it in between my second and third years, which was an interesting challenge when I went back and everything was out of date and the syllabus had changed and so on. But I actually quite enjoyed being a student union president because it taught me an awful lot about the issues and challenges that different communities face and how, in many respects, they weren't different for the ones that I'd faced. And so that's where I started to learn a sense of what solidarity is and how actually struggles and fights for better equality aren't just for those people who will immediately benefit, it's for all of us. And that was a real learning experience for me in terms of we need to work together on this agenda, because otherwise, if we just leave it to women to fight for women's rights and LGBT people fight for our rights and etc., then actually we won't get very far. So I was really proud to have been part of some of those battles. And of course, when I left university in 1997, I had to be quite careful about where I applied to work, because it was entirely legitimate for people to be sacked because of their sexual orientation. No protection in law. In fact, there was no protection in law until 2003 in the workplace.
It's actually quite hard to remember what we've gone through, isn't it, and how recent it was. Sorry.
I'm a lot older than most of my rights. So I when I was looking to what to do, I literally rang up HR departments. Didn't have the internet in those days. I rang up HR departments and asked them to send me their policies and procedures and read through them. And that's why I ended up applying to work in the NHS rather than in the private sector. Because the private sector, at that time, I couldn't find a single organisation that would publicly say that if it employed me, they would value me.
Incredible. If anybody's got questions, by the way, pop your hands up. I've got a load of questions here, so there's no pressure on you, but if you would like to, then feel free. So how did you move from the NHS into politics then? So
the NHS scheme that I joined was basically the management fast track scheme in the NHS, which was a 2-year placement-based training scheme, which gave you a management qualification at the end of it. And that's what brought me back to the North East. Because there were about 30 placements around the country, And I'd applied for the Northern Yorkshire region, as it was then in the NHS, and got one of the 5 places here, and ended up, my first job was as the medical records manager in South Tyneside General Hospital. Wow. Which, I tell you, you had to be very careful what you said to in South Tyneside, because I didn't realise they didn't all have the same surnames, but everybody was related to everybody else. I learned that one the hard way. So I did the NHS management training scheme was a sort of 2-year thing where I did various roles in the NHS, and then got a proper management job actually in North Tyneside in primary care. And I then started getting involved in local politics. I'd always kept the interest in politics from university days, but never really thought about getting involved more in terms of local politics, and went along to Labour Party branch meetings. So if anybody has ever been to Labour Party branch meetings, you know how awful they are. 2 hours of arguing about the minutes, then a collection for the room.
It's glamorous.
That's if you're lucky, because otherwise it won't be quorate. There were very few people who were willing to stand as candidates, so I was persuaded to put myself forward, and in 2000 was elected as a councillor in Newcastle, representing actually this area here, and just this bit of the West End and St James's Park. And up until then, I'd kind of thought, well, I might be interested in doing more in this. That might be a really good stepping stone to being a Member of Parliament. And, within about 5 years, I thought, why would I want to be an MP when I can make a difference here? And it's not local government and being a councillor. It isn't as high profile. It isn't well paid. It's not that glamorous. People often stop you and tell you exactly what they think. But, it's so much more rewarding than being involved in something. I mean, a lot of my friends were opposition MPs for, well, God knows how many years. And, the thing that they always say is it's so good that you could get something done. So the political story here is I was elected in 2000. In 2004, Labour lost control of the council. And I'd only ever been a backbench councillor, but there was pretty much a wipeout. And there were only, I think, 24 Labour councillors left. Nobody wanted to be leader. So I said, well, I'll do it. And actually, I was I'd be deputy leader. So I was deputy leader for 3 years, and then leader of the Labour group, as it was, leader of the opposition, from 2007 onwards. And that's when I started to rebuild the party in the city, because what I saw in Labour at that time was a party which was arrogant, out of touch, disconnected, not representative, and much more concerned with fighting amongst itself over matters of minutiae that was no relevance to anybody else than serving the public. And so I knew I had a job on my hands. And I used to have Labour group meetings when people would say, well, now the public are wrong about that. And you think, it's not a great starting point, is it? If you're a electorate, you tell them they're wrong on stuff. How to persuade people to support you. In 2011, so we started picking up seats in the rounds of local elections. And then in 2011, we just tipped over into majority control. And now, so some of the people in the Labour group had tolerated me in opposition because nobody else wanted to do it, because it's a hard job and it's not very glamorous and it means all the donkey work but no reward. And they thought that they were going to have a coup once we got into power. So I've done the hard work and then just not been leader.
Because
I was a useful idiot as far as they were concerned to get us back into power, and then they were going to take over again. This is all gossip I can tell you now. And I got wind of this, and on the day of the count, I rang up Ed Miliband and said, Ed, can you send me a shadow cabinet member so that as soon as we tip over the line, I can walk out the Civic Centre and be introduced as the new leader by the shadow cabinet member. So basically, they thought they were going to have a coup and boot me out, and I side-fucked them. It was Mary Cray, because she was the closest shadow cabinet member. She was in Wakefield. She jumped on a train in Wakefield and came straight up to Newcastle.
Amazing.
And she got here within 15 minutes to spare. We literally just went out, and we were all over the national news, and then it was very difficult for anybody to challenge me as leader after that.
And how out were you during all this journey?
Oh, yeah. So I did for those of you that remember this funny old thing called newspapers, back in 2007 when I became leader of the Labour group, I did an interview with the Journal. It was all very sort of homes and gardens. They came and took pictures. Pose with a mug, pose with the other half in front of a clock. It was all a bit stilted. But that was I thought, I just need to get this out of the way. And if it's out there, it's not my responsibility to keep telling people, but nobody can ever use it against me. And so, and I don't know whether we're going to talk about choir, but that weekend when I went to a rehearsal, one of the colleagues in my section had a copy of the Journal. And I thought, oh God, what's he going to say? And he said, well done, son. I thought it was lovely.
Oh, well, tell us about choir then, because you were doing a big... You've told me this story already, so I don't want to steal it from you, but you were about to do a performance.
Oh, Lord, yes. So, I mentioned the violin when I was little, and I throughout my teens, the thing that was my sort of escape, I suppose, was music. And so I played the violin, I played the viola, I played the piano. And when I went to university, students, a bit lazy, I don't want to carry a violin around with me, couldn't be bothered finding a piano, so I took up singing, because it's dead easy, you just turn up and sing. You don't have to carry anything apart from the music. So I took up singing at university and sang in the university choir, and liked it so much that when I came back to the Northeast, I rang up my old piano teacher and said, can you recommend a choir? And so I went and auditioned for the Northern Symphonia Chorus, with who I still sing 26 years later, which is a real joy and pleasure. Because there's something about performing music that, certainly for me, means you can't think about anything else. And so I find it really relaxing, even though it's quite intellectually demanding and physically demanding. So at the time, round about 2010, well, no, actually, about 2008, 2009, we got a new chorus director who wanted us all to basically up our game. And so we were all encouraged to go and have singing lessons. And I had singing lessons, and my singing teacher was really keen that I did some solo stuff, which I'd never thought of before, but I went and did some solo, I put together a solo recital, I did some solo parts from Messiah at Christmas, that kind of thing. I find it absolutely petrifying, by the way, because if anybody who's done that, when you're singing alone, by yourself, there is nowhere to hide. It's really exposing. And so I found it actually quite nerve-wracking. And I had a recital booked for June 2011 because we hadn't expected to take control of the council. So there's me dealing with the aftermath of the election, all the stuff that came with that, and also having to do a bloody recital in 6 weeks' time. And I was a bit worried about, would anybody turn up and cause damage or mischief? But no, it went well. So I did a Finzi and Vaughan Williams song cycle.
Marvellous.
Which I enjoyed, but I've not done anything since.
It's very impressive, Nick. It is. It is. How out were you continually over the years? Have you got any good stories about coming out or about...
Well, one of the things I found is that in my leadership role, and I can talk about some of the national stuff as well in a moment, but in my leadership role, I found I had to come out most days to somebody, because you just work in an environment where people make assumptions about you. And of course, the kind of role that I was undertaking, we meet lots of different people all the time. And how many times do people start a conversation with, oh, are you married? What's your wife called? Oh, have you got kids? How many kids have you got? That kind of thing. And it's one of those things where you have to make a snap judgment in that moment. How much am I going to disclose about myself to this person that I've never met before? Can I trust them? Do I want to? Do I feel brave enough to do it today? So, it's one of those extra complexities that LGBT people have to navigate in daily life. And do you know what? It takes a hell of a lot of energy to try to be somebody that you're not. And it was a real realization to me. I mean, I had some pretty horror stories from working in the NHS as well, which I might touch on. But it was a real reminder to me that actually, if we want to get the best out of people at work, if we want people to feel comfortable and able to be part of a society, then we can't have people hiding parts of themselves. And that means that we've got to challenge the barriers and the prejudice and the discrimination that stops people from doing it because they feel afraid. Mm-hmm. When I was working in the NHS, I did a very short spell working in South Tyneside Primary Care Trust, as it was. I did 3 months, which every day felt like a year. And one of the reasons I left was because I had a delegation from a guy from the senior management team who came to say, "We've just decided as a senior management team that we think it's okay for you to be gay, but please don't do it in the workplace." I thought, what do they think it involves? And
how did you respond to that? Can you remember?
Well, what's it got to do with my work? Well, we wouldn't want anybody to get the wrong idea that you might fancy them. Like, look at yourself. And I just found it. I just did not enjoy that workplace whatsoever. And actually, it was that prompted me to look for a job that was going to be flexible enough to be able to develop a political career alongside. And that's when I moved into working in the voluntary sector. And that was where I was for the rest of my professional career. In fact, I worked full-time and then part-time while I was leader up until 2016.
We'll take a question from the lady at the back.
Am I too quiet?
No, you're fine. I actually have a question. I'm actually an ex-MSHES person. I had a great time coming out at MSHES, so it was fine. I was based in Birmingham. But my question is, I know that sometimes people feel that companies can do the things that look fun, and they don't feel like that's got the underlying sort of change, and that's not coming about MSHES, by the way. That's just and I just wondered if there's anything you've come across where that sort of real fundamental change followed through that you felt has been really helpful in your workplace.
So when I was leader of Newcastle City Council, I was worried about exactly that. And I was determined. So I was saying earlier that because of my personal experience growing up, I was determined that there should be no outsiders and nobody should feel isolated or marginalised or not able to be themselves. And so we entered the Stonewall Equality Index of employers. Now, I know Stonewall is now a slightly more controversial organisation, but at the time, it was the gold standard for organisational development and culture and practice. Every year, I would have the management team saying, "Well, we entered it last year. Have we not done it?" And I said, "No, we're not done yet. We've got to keep going." And every year, we rose up the table, up the table, up the table. In 2019, we were the top local authority. We actually were in the number 1 slot nationally. And that's one of the things that I was really proud of in terms of leading the organisation, because it didn't want to do it. But by the time we got there, I think everybody had realised that there was so many wider benefits to having an organisational culture which was inclusive and supportive, rather than one where people, hid parts of themselves.
Yeah. Or the companies get the rainbow flags out for 1 month
well,
a
that's
year.
The other thing that really irritates me, that they put the flags up for a month, then they come down again.
Yeah.
It's like, is my money only worth that much for 1 month?
You're only gay for that month. There's a gentleman at the front who had a question, then I'll come to you.
Yeah, just tying to with obviously Pride, which in its current form started around 2008, obviously grew a lot whilst you were leader of the City Council. So I was just wondering, how have you noticed say, hard to manage the change around attitudes to pride whilst you've kind of in city council? Also, was there any challenge to pride and its presence in the city that you had to manage in that role?
It's interesting. It's a really interesting question. When I first started going to the first Pride I ever went to was in London back in 1996 or thereabouts, and Pride then was very much an active political protest. It wasn't a celebration of anything. It was a reminder of the barriers that we had in so many parts of our lives that prevented us from progressing. So, and I know this is one of the things that people from my generation struggle with sometimes, the idea that Pride is now a celebration and has commercial sponsorship and so on, because there is a bit of a sense, well, actually, we've not quite finished with the equality agenda yet. I think it's possible to do both. And I certainly, so one of the things that I used to get virtually every year was, well, we need to make some savings. Can we cut the events budget? And that means shaving off some of the community projects. Pride and the Mellor were the two that I absolutely fought every year to protect. And I mean, Peter knows how little money it is in the grand scheme of things, but I knew that amount of money leveraged in a huge amount of additional stuff. And they also, people kept complaining about these gays on the town moor and kept asking, could they not move them somewhere else? It's like, no.
We had a question from a gentleman in the middle, and then I'll come to you.
I was interested in what you said about the South Tyneside. I'm from South Tyneside, actually, South Tyneside Hospital, and the suspicion you were doing was sort of in 1997. I was in the civil service around about that time. I think there was a lot of fear amongst gay people on security risk. And I know you said you were working on the record. Do you think that was part of the prejudice you sort of got from the management?
Why did they think we were a security risk?
Well, because you could be blackmailed and things. It was sort of at that time.
It's why I wasn't recruited for MI5 at university, I'm convinced.
It's a time when AIDS and HIV was prevalent as well. You know, where I know of incidents where records were sort of, there was worry that information came out, and things like that, especially if you were gay and had access to them.
Yeah, and it was a really. It was a really, well, the thing that really irritated me, and I tried to change, but I wasn't there long enough to do it. Anybody who was HIV positive had a big red round sticker on the front of their medical records. It's like, come on, that's not really appropriate. Until there are, I challenged that at the time. I mean, it's different now that we've moved to electronic health records, but that was the kind of unthinking prejudice that people did for the right intentions, because they wanted people to be aware and take appropriate precautions. But actually, all it did was reinforce a sense of discrimination and prejudice. And one of the things that I find, sorry, I'm going to segue across into something else now, but one of the things that I find really, so when I was at university, one of the things that was happening at the time was the debate on the age of consent and the equalisation of the age of consent. And if you remember, it was reduced from 21 to 18, not 16. And I remember listening to these debates in Parliament on the radio with these, ferociously whiskered Tory MPs going on about buggery and schoolboys and things. And it was appalling. It was appalling that anybody could say anything like that about anybody else in our national parliament. But what makes me even more angry is I see the same arguments now being used against trans people. Culture wars, the politics of division and the idea that a minority group who are vulnerable in our society could be used to make a political point, I find sick in politics. And one of the big changes that I felt in my time was a move from politics genuinely being about public service, and that's what motivated people, and people had different solutions depending on which party they were part of. But that's changed, and it's now about tribal politics and identity, and which tribe you're in and which tribe you're not in. And the problem I have with that is, instead of focusing on the common agenda we have, it focuses on what our differences are. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing tensions increasing in so many ways. And this is not just a theoretical agenda for me. My niece is trans, and so it's a very personal agenda because I see her pain on a weekly basis.
We we're quite a diverse community within ourselves, all the different letters of LGBTQI, all the different ones. How would you suggest that we can come together and stand together better than maybe we have done so far?
Why should we criticise ourselves? I think there are still things to be challenged, but we've got to recognise that there's a bigger change going on in society, that we don't in general life, we don't have the same community spaces anymore. We don't have community centres really, and we don't do community activities in communities particularly. It's only particular events at particular times of the year where we come together. We've sort of privatised a lot of our out of work time into what happens behind our front doors, and most of what we do nowadays is, well, a lot of socialising now is online rather than in person. So I don't think we should be critical of ourselves because there's a wider change going on in society. I do think it's important that we keep visible and the presence, because I worry that there is an acceptance of nice gays and there's still distaste of bad gays.
Yeah. We had a question at the front and then I'll come to you at the back.
It might be a very simplistic question, but to get to number one in
2019, I think.
Yeah, sorry, 2019. How much of that was by you leading, and I'm going to use the word inappropriately, dictating that this is what we're going to do, and how much of that was with kind of democratically bringing people along? Because I think that's what I really struggle with in the NHS where I am, is getting that tension between pulling people to where it needs to be, but I'm pushing. It's like,
I learned a lot about organisational change through that process, because one of the most important things I learned is that often people who are in structural leadership positions aren't always great leaders, and so there's the structural leadership, and then you get, I guess, professional and technical leadership. But the leadership that's most powerful is the ability for people to inspire others and build coalitions of change. And that meant, for me, not starting with what the structure was and asking the structure to respond to my requests, but trying to inspire people to start doing it organically themselves and creating a movement within the organisation for that. And we did that through a staff group, we did that through directorates, we did that through the chief exec taking this seriously and being really consistent about this was an important agenda. And also, frankly, me not playing a very big role publicly around it, because I was very aware that if I did, people would say, well, he would do that, wouldn't he? And I didn't want it to be about me. I wanted it to be about the organisation. So the thing that I learned most was work with where the energy is. Because often people in senior positions, sorry if anybody applies this applies to everybody in the room, but can often block things if they don't think it fits with their accepted norms.
Great question.
I wonder if you've got any thoughts about the attrition on leaders as we engage with people who are just horrible or wrong. So I reflect that when I was a young person, when I was a student, it was when William Hague was leading the opposition, who had some horrendous views and spoke about Indigenous people in horrendous ways. But then in later years spoke about how we had engaged with people, spoken to people and changed his mind. And actually I think it's always been about, do we forgive, do we forget, what do we do? But we can't forget the attrition. And I wonder in terms of the leadership experiences you've had, about how, it's quite common, I think, in terms of language talk about if someone is opposed to us, we just can't. I mean, I absolutely accept the charge and debate it, but we don't engage with people who are problematic for us. But then I wonder about the people who've lost the opportunity to change minds and take people on that journey. So I just wonder about your experiences, and if you could share some of that with us.
A good example of that is Sayyidah Varsi, Baroness Varsi, who these days is a modern, cuddly, comfortable, conservative peer who's actually quite critical of how the Tory party is drifting to the right. I remember when she was a candidate in Keighley in 2005 and put out a leaflet basically entirely homophobic. And so I struggle with the idea, I struggle with the idea that people can sort of just put all of that aside without it having meant anything or without recognising it. And one of the things that I am probably most proud of from having grown up as a gay man is a sense of empathy that it gave me for others. And empathy, I'm afraid, is a quality that's sadly lacking in a lot of politics. Empathy and compassion. And the ability to think as others think, not as you do. Have I had experiences of that? The thing that irritated me more was the sort of what you call these days microaggressions. The people who always insisted on sending a Christmas card to Mr. and Mrs. Forbes, for example, or inviting me with a +1 to an event, so I turn up with my other half. It's like, oh, who's this? He got quite good at being quite rude and putting people in their place. And the thing that I struggle with, if I'm honest, is I still carry a lot of that baggage from my early years and early experiences that I know future generations don't carry because they've been born at a different time, in a more progressive time. But I know I still have baggage, and I still find I can't hold my partner's hand in public, for example. I just can't do it because I'm worried about what might happen. And so that's the sort of lasting impact that the cumulative nature of things that have happened over the years has, I think.
Yeah, that's very sad, actually, and poignant. Yeah, Matt.
On that point, Nick, do you think that makes the younger generation more empowered or naive to the history and the fight that's kind of gone before them?
I would love future generations and current generations to see it as a positive thing and not have an association with pain or hurt. And it's one of the things that I think we're starting to see in our media. I remember when I was younger, never, ever, ever saw anybody gay in adverts on, television. I suppose it was Larry Grayson and John Inman. Great role models. And of course, that was then used to take the piss out of us all the time.
Yeah.
So when we first started seeing them in adverts and on TV programs, it was like, oh my God, did I just see that? Rewind. But even now, often LGBT characters have a defining melancholy or sadness around their role as a result of their identity, rather than just being a normal person who might be good, might be bad, but is just part of the story. And even now, I think there's an association with sadness somehow, which I hope future generations won't experience.
Jamie.
It's not really a question, it's a comment, to be honest. I feel like there's a lot of gay men who are older who have just gone, well, gay rights have moved on, that's it, job done, let's all move on because we're okay, so everyone else must be. And it's really refreshing to hear someone who's still got the fight, not just for people who are gender expansive, trans, etc., but also you've mentioned just everybody being okay, and that includes all minorities, and just that's brilliant.
Well, thank you. That's a very, very kind thing to say. And it's. I said before about why I got involved in Labour politics because of Section 28. Being gay was my political beginning, but it was also my political end. One of the things that I tried really hard to do was ensure that the council took all equalities issues, particularly protected characteristics, seriously, and we didn't have a hierarchy. But that's not the case within the Labour Party, certainly not the Labour Party in the city. It has a hierarchy of minorities. And it's women, BME, LGBT, disability. And I don't know if you know I don't know if people know the story of what happened to me. But every year, every 4 years, councillors are re-elected, and that means you have to go through a reselection process amongst the members in your ward. And I was deselected by the members in my ward because I didn't represent diversity that they recognised. And because they wanted somebody further up on that hierarchy, I was expendable. Despite being one of the very few openly gay council leaders in the country, despite being a national leader, despite at the time being part of the shadow cabinet, it was more important to have somebody who represented what they thought was a more important form of diversity. And it really, really hurt me that something that I had personally fought for was then used against me. And it was a pretty awful experience because it made me really question why had I done all of that. Of course, now I can put it all in perspective and say, actually, that was just what was going on at the time, and product of circumstances, etc. But the thing that concerns me is that I was talking about tribal politics earlier. There's a danger that we retreat into different tribes and don't see the common experience of discrimination, regardless of which tribe we happen to be in. And that's what worries me about what I start to see around the world now, with people starting to roll back in America on abortion rights, in Hungary on LGBT rights, in other parts of the world on women's rights. Those are all our fight. Yeah. And it really worries me that battles that we thought we'd won and banked the victories of, we're going to have to fight all over again.
So this is a room of leaders and aspiring leaders from different sectors. What would be your sort of final call to action, if you like, coming out of this talk, for them to take back to their workplaces or into their lives?
So, I don't think I've told you enough funny stories either. I feel as though I got quite serious there. I'll tell you this one because, well, actually, I'll tell you two. Have I got time to tell two?
Yeah.
So
my watch has stopped working. Actually,
we didn't. I don't often get an audience like this, so hey, we didn't talk much about coming out, but coming out to family was a lot less hard than I feared it was going to be. It was one of the things where I built up and worried about it for a year, and then just sort of blurted it out, and there was this kind of, oh well, really. My mum said, "Oh, can you tell me something I don't know?" And my grandparents lived in the same place that I went to university, so I used to go and see them while I was at university. And my grandfather died while I was there, and I never had the courage to come out because they were very sort of prim and proper and Times-reading conservatives, and you can imagine. Bed by 9:30 and no decaf coffee after 5:30 in the afternoon. So I finally, and also very church-goey, and so I finally plucked up the courage to tell my grandma that I was gay just before I left university. And she was sat there in her armchair, and she said, "Oh, my dear," she said, "your grandfather and I thought so years ago." So I kind of, I wish I'd known that, because I wouldn't have missed out on not telling you about bits of my life. So after what happened to me politically, Keir Starmer invited me down for a chat and a cup of tea, and what he clearly thought was going to be a tea and sympathy conversation. And I was slightly more robust with him than that, and told him where some of his political problems were. Keir and I have known each other for a long time, so I felt I could, and still do feel I can say that to him. But you know how when you have a conversation and you sort of do the business, then you have the sort of 2 or 3 minutes of wrapping up polite bits. He said, as we were sort of chatting, he said, "So how old are your kids then?" And I just looked at him and said, "Keir, I'm a patron of LGBT Labour. How do you not know that I'm gay?" And he was mortified. He did that. He was mortified about it. And was actually quite upset that he'd made such a faux pas. I mean, I still do tease him about it from time to time. And I told him, for that, mate, you've got to wear glitter at Pride on your face. So he did. That's my fault. Final thoughts.
Before you give your final thoughts, there was a gentleman who had a
Share
question.
a fun story about Nick, and it's not the one of you dancing on stage with the cheeky girls. When I was chair of Northern Pride in 2011, and Nick was a fantastic supporter and would fight for us to get money in the Mellor, as you mentioned. Nick always used to do the 6 colours in the flag talk.
Yes.
And it used to be like, oh, frick, we're going to this other thing, he's going to raise the flag, he's going to mention that we've got 6 colours in the flag, and when we get 7 colours, that's when we'll have full, inclusivity, and we'll be fully... And it was the conversation that always went. And so it was Northern Pride, the eve, and you were raising the flag.
Oh God, I know what's coming.
Council, and there was 300 people there, and the press, etc., and I was stood there next to you, and the flag was going up, and we will have 7 colours in the flag when we get equality. And I stood there and I counted them, and he came up and he said, "What did you think?" I went, "You're flying the wrong flag, and we've got equality, there's 7 up there." He said, "Smile to the press, darling." But then on the serious side, in 2016 when the Pulse nightclub massacre happened, and we were a week away from Northern Pride, the Evening Chronicle did a story that it was happening, and some foolish person said that they were going to come up with a machine gun and kill us, and Nick and the police acted immediately. This person was arrested, it went to court, they ended up in the front of the Daily Mirror, they lost their job, they lost their wife. Bizarrely, their daughter was lesbian, and they just did it because they were drunk. But Nick was a fantastic ally all the way through that. So it's leading by example as well. But every time I walk past the place, I count the colours of the flag. I remember the Nick Forbes speech.
Amazing.
Well, I'm pleased you can get past 5, Pet.
Give us your final thoughts then, Nick.
So, I mean, we've not really talked about public services here, but I know quite a lot of people in the room will be involved in public services, and there can be a sense that the job's done in terms of equality in public services sometimes. But there is only one care home in the entire country for LGBT people. One. And I have heard some horrendous stories of people having to go back into the closet in care homes because they were being, well, in some cases, preyed at by the staff, which is just horrible. So we know that there's work to do for people later in life to enjoy retirement with dignity and respect. We know that there's still discrimination in the workplace. So we know that we have to do more. And if there is a single child in this country who is going to school afraid of what they're going to face in bullying and discrimination during the school day, we've still got work to do. And leadership on this isn't something that's somebody else's responsibility, it's ours. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for the difference that you make.
That's amazing. Thank you.